So in this video we are going to put together the center blocks for the sweet salsa quilt. And the center blocks are a number of blocks made out of 9 squares. So I have laid out next to my sewing machine the blocks or the squares that I need for the first block. Now the pattern will have the exact layout for each of the blocks, and you'll want to study that carefully and kind of follow and do each block one by one so that you get the right balance of color. So here I've stitched the first 2 blocks together and finger pressed the seam to the left. And again, I'm finger pressing the seam to the left. And now on the second row, here's where you want to look at the pattern, layout, and make sure that the stripe is vertical or horizontal, whichever one block you're doing. Oh my gosh, this is going in slow motion. That happened. Okay, I think I have it fixed so that it's no longer in slow motion. So let's see how it goes. So on the upper row, I finger press to the left, and on the middle row, I'm going to finger press the seams to the right. And this row, finger press the seam to the left. So you don't have to iron at this step. You can go ahead and sew them together without pressing. I just think it's a little tidier this way. So now you'll see why we press to the left, to the right, and to the left. Because now you have the seams on opposite sides of the seam, and they kind of nest together in there. And it allows you to line up the seams so that you have nice, tight, perfect corners. So you just nest them up, and you'll feel them. There's no lump when you hold it between your fingers, but visually you can see there that it's lined up. And then You just pin right on the seam and you're good to go. So now I noticed that the bottom squares aren't perfectly lined up, so I am going to put an additional pin just to keep that edge lined up. I like to get as close to the pin as possible, and if you have a needle down setting on your sewing machine, that's useful here. So it stops with the needle down, so when you take the pin out there's no distortion. So I took the pin out because it was lined up at the top, but it was not lined up at the bottom. So if you put your pin in right on the seam line, going in and out, and then if you look at the back side, it should line up. Okay, and that's the first block, so I just have to press those last two seams. I'm going to press them pointing out. The upper right hand corner, because as you start assembling and sewing these blocks of squares together, you can get kind of discombobulated, at least I do. And so if I always know the upper right hand corner of the piece, that saves time because you don't have to sit and study it and go, now which end is what? Okay, so we have our blocks cut, our pieces cut, and now we're going to start to assemble them. So the first thing I do is I finger press a crease halfway in both directions. And this finger pressed guideline helps you to make sure that when you add these triangles that they are perfectly centered. So the first thing I do is put the point on the fold, and then I slide the triangle down so that the edges are lined up. I'm trying to be expedient here and not pin, but you'll see what happens when you try to be expedient and not pin. So you can see my seams have, my top piece has moved and it's not perfectly lined up. And what ended up with this block is that it was not quite big enough when it came to trimming it into the exact square that it needs to be. So if this happens to you, don't do what I'm doing. Rip that baby out and re-sew it. And now I've decided to pin. So because I didn't redo that one, kind of the whole block is, well, I guess I probably could still pull it out. I was going to say it's trashed, but I could probably still rip it out. The other thing is, when you start sewing, make sure you measure from your needle to where your line is for the 1/4 inch or the scant 1/4 inch, because if it's not exact, it's going to cause you lots of grief as you sew. And I did check my needle position to make sure it was exactly a 1/4 inch, and then I refreshed, because I have a different foot on than I used before. I refreshed and double checked and measured that first test seam wasn't on this block but on a different block, to make sure that my 1/4 inch seam allowance was very accurate. So it's always good to do like a test block before you sew all of the blocks for the quilt, because if you make a mistake, if your seam allowance is off and you've made 49,000 of these blocks, it's going to be a nightmare at the end. Not just for this quilt, but for quilting in general. So accuracy is kind of a big deal. So you can see how helpful that finger pressed X is. It really makes sure everything is exactly as it should be. Another thing to keep in mind when you're sewing this particular piece right here is that you're sewing the black triangle, you're sewing on a bias. So you really don't want to stretch or pull in any way, because it will distort the triangle. Okay, so let's square up this block. I'm looking for the edge that is the most wonky. In other words, the one where the edges line up the least, and I start with that one. So I'm lining it up with the shortest edge, and then I use that one of the lines across to make sure that it's squared up with the diamond. And I just do that as like a double check. Now I've flipped it horizontally, and if you see the tape that I have on the ruler, that's just so I can quickly and easily get to the exact size that the that the cut block should be. I don't have to look for those little marks every time I make a cut, so it does speed things up. And now I want to line up with the top or the bottom edge of the block and make sure that the seam I'm cutting is square with that edge, the top or bottom edge, which are the ones I just cut. So you can see there's not a lot of excess for trimming, which is why it's really important to have your seam allowance correct and to sew accurately. So that's it for this block. See you in the next step. The next step in this process is to add, let me get this edge up here, is to add these blocks. Maybe I can zoom out. Oops, wrong way. I don't know if that's helpful. We're going to sew these two blocks to here. So, and then the same at the bottom. So let me set this aside. And these are identical blocks, so we're going to put them right sides together, and I'm going to zoom in a little so you can see maybe better. So what I like to do to get the points to line up, because when they're sewn you want them to be you want them to match. So what I do is I stick my pin in right at that intersection of that, can you see that? Of the corner of the block, and then I do the same thing here. Okay, so now we know those 2 points meet, and then I go ahead and line up the edges. And now we know, so we've got the edges lined up. Sorry, no, there we go. So the top of the block is lined up, and we know that this is lined up here. So I'm just going to turn and push that through, and now I'm ready to sew. And when you get to this point, and I don't know how well you can see on, oh. Sorry about this. Yeah, still a little hard to see, but basically I'm stitching right up to that exact point, which should be 1/4 of an inch from the edge. Now actually it looks like it's not exactly perfect. It looks like it kind of bowed out a little bit here, but it is right on the corner. So let's take a look and just see. So there is a tiny space there, so that bow and that line is making a difference. So I'm just going to go back in and stitch part of that and try and keep it straighter. Sometimes what happens with my machine, there we go, is that there's some bulk there, and when you go over it, sometimes if you're not careful, it So there we go. So now we have a nice perfect point. And then we're going to do another one of these. And one goes at the top of the squares and one goes at the bottom. And then the next step would be to join the two long sides and sew them on. In this video, we are going to assemble the border blocks. So you'll start with a square and cut it diagonally to come up with the first triangle, and then you'll have a number of strips. And instead of pre-cutting all of these, I leave them in the strip and cut as I go. And I like to think that that saves me fabric and work, actually. So the most important thing about this block, the most important thing to remember is that when you stitch this seam that I'm stitching right now, that triangle is on the bias, and that means that it's very easily stretched and distorted. So when you handle the block and when you sew it, you don't want to you want it to feed naturally through the sewing machine. You don't want to pull on it or do anything too crazy with it because it will distort the block. So after that, as we add the strips, we're not on the bias, so it's not as critical. It's just this particular stitch right here, or seam, not stitch. So now I finger press these as I go, so the seam is away from the triangle, and then I run an iron over it before I add the next strip. So I have my finished block measured out, and I have tape on the ruler there, and I lay that on top so that, again, I can gauge the length of this strip so I'm not wasting fabric. So I cut it so that it will cover the block but not have a big long extra tail there. And I do that for all of these strips until the very last one, and then you'll see my little trick. Again, I finger press and then hit it with the hot iron. And I'm going to speed up the next couple strips here, and then I'll come back and chat about the very last triangle. So now let's talk about putting these blocks together. So here's the one, see, now I have to trim it a second time. This is the one where I trimmed the block first and then added the triangle, and now I have to go back in a second time and trim that triangle so that it's accurate. This is why I went to the folding it in half, because to me it's much quicker in the long run. Okay, so the first thing you want to do is look at the pattern and make sure you're putting these together in the right orientation. And then you want to line up the seams and pin. Now we're not doing the nesting thing on this because they are all pressed in the same direction, not opposite directions. And in the end, because of this, I will press the seam open after it's sewn. So now I flipped it over so that when I'm sewing not against that raw edge there, but with it, and that just makes it a little bit easier. Less things to worry about, the presser foot catching the edge of the seam. And there is a little bulk here, so I need to go just a little slower. The other thing about this seam is that these edges are all bias edges because they're cut at the 45-degree angle. So again, you don't want to pull or distort in any way this seam. So another reason to go a little slower. The moment of truth. It looks like everything matches up pretty good. And now I'm going to press the seam open. So the next step is to sew 4 of these together and then stitch them to the top of the diamond blocks. Also, you're going to stitch 4 together and sew them to the bottom of the diamond blocks, and then you're going to sew all the side border blocks and stitch them to the side.